Have you ever looked around and realized that everyone else seems to be moving forward while you're still stuck in the same old place? You scroll through pictures of smiling faces, hear the laughter of people who seem to have it all together, and wonder quietly, did God forget about me somewhere along the way? Maybe it wasn't a single tragedy that broke you, but 1,000 tiny disappointments, doors that closed, people who left, dreams that quietly expired. You tell yourself you're fine. You keep working, keep praying, keep showing up at church. But deep down you feel invisible, as though heaven's spotlight has shifted away from your story. If you've ever carried that ache of being unseen, unchosen, unnecessary, then the Bible carries your name inside its pages. Because hidden between the famous kings and prophets is a man whose story begins in obscurity and ends in the embrace of grace. His name was Mephibosheth. The Hebrew tongue is poetic. Names mean something. Mephibosheth roughly translates to, from the mouth of shame. He lived with that word hanging over him like a cloud, a label that described not just his condition but his identity. He was a prince by birth, the grandson of Israel's first king, Saul, and the son of the warrior Jonathan. He entered the world surrounded by royal robes and covenant promises. But in a single day, his destiny collapsed. When news came that Saul and Jonathan had died on Mount Gilboa, panic swept through the palace. In the chaos, his nurse tried to flee with the 5-year-old boy, terrified that David, the rival anointed by God, would wipe out Saul's lineage. But as she ran, she stumbled. The child fell and his legs were shattered beyond healing. From that day forward, he could no longer walk. From royal nursery to permanent exile in one heartbeat. Years passed, kings rose and fell. David established Jerusalem as his capital, built armies, composed psalms, and led a nation. And somewhere far from the palace, in the wasteland east of the Jordan, a forgotten man dragged himself across the dust of Lodabar, a region whose very name means no pasture, no word, no future. It was a place for the discarded, the disabled, and the displaced. If the palace was the symbol of abundance, Lodabar was the echo of absence. There, Mephibosheth learned to live small. He kept his head low. He depended on others for movement, for meals, for meaning. Every time a stranger approached, his heart tightened with the same thought. Maybe they've come to finish what the sword began. You see, in the honor-shame culture of ancient Israel, a surviving heir of a fallen dynasty was not a guest of the new king. He was a threat. The safest thing for Mephibosheth to do was disappear. And maybe that's exactly where you find yourself, hiding in your own Lodabar. It may not be a desert plain, but it feels like one. A quiet apartment that only brings you bad memories. A job that no longer feeds your soul. A relationship that ended and took your confidence with it. You live in the tension between what was promised and what is. But here's the miracle. Grace has a longer reach than shame. While Mephibosheth believed his story was finished, heaven was already writing his next chapter. Because the heart of King David, now the most powerful man in Israel, still remembered a covenant, a HASN, a sacred promise of loyal love made years before with Jonathan. And that ancient word, HASN, means more than mercy. It means love that refuses to let go. So if you've ever wondered whether God's grace could still find you after the fall, after the silence, after the years of hiding, this story is your answer. Because Mephibosheth didn't climb out of Lodabar to look for the king. The king came looking for him. And maybe even now, in the quiet corner of your own life, the footsteps of grace are already approaching. This is not a story about a man who searched for God. It's about a God who never stopped searching for a man called shame. Lean in, because before this tale ends, you'll see what happens when divine love walks into the land of no pasture and calls a forgotten soul by name. Before the desert silence of Lodabar, there was music. There were days when little Mephibosheth ran, yes, ran through corridors of cedar and stone, his laughter echoing off the palace walls of Gibeah. The scent of oil lamps and roasted grain filled the air. Courtiers bowed as the grandson of King Saul passed by. His tiny feet were swift, his future certain. Israel was still young then, a kingdom barely finding its rhythm under its first monarch. Saul towered over men in stature and reputation, and his son Jonathan, Mephibosheth's father, was the people's hero. Jonathan's bow never missed, and his heart belonged wholly to God. At royal banquets, servants whispered of the boy's destiny. "That one will inherit his father's courage," they said. "He will restore the house of Saul." And somewhere in the bustling palace, between military councils and harp songs, two men, Jonathan and David, swore an oath that would outlive them both. Scripture calls it a covenant of HASN, steadfast, covenantal love. In Hebrew, Hesed is not mere affection. It's loyalty sealed by the fear of God. They promised to guard one another's descendants, whatever the future might hold. No one knew how much that single vow would matter to a child still learning his father's voice. Then came the unraveling. The songs of triumph faded into whispers of jealousy. Saul's disobedience fractured his mind, and the young shepherd from Bethlehem began to rise in the people's eyes. David killed Goliath. The women sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." For Mephibosheth, childhood became a lesson in the fragility of crowns. Where once the palace was filled with celebration, now it pulsed with tension. He learned to read the fear in servants' eyes, to sense when the corridors grew too quiet. One evening, thunder rolled across the hills, and soldiers galloped through the gates with torn garments and dust-covered faces. The message was short and final. The king and his sons are dead. In a world without due process or mercy for fallen dynasties, that meant one thing: the purge was coming. The nurse seized the boy and fled. Her sandals slapped the pavement, heart pounding with the dread that David's men would soon arrive. Scripture gives us the moment in a single tragic sentence. She fled in haste, and it came to pass that she fell, and the child became lame. That fall divided his life into before and after. Before, laughter, royal robes, and the hope of inheritance. After, silence, pain, and hiding. Ancient Israel had little space for those with physical impairments. The Torah spoke of ritual purity for temple service, and the culture, steeped in honor and strength, often equated physical wholeness with divine favor. To be crippled was to live in perpetual question. What sin caused this? So Mephibosheth learned to see himself through the eyes of others. Half a man, half a memory. He watched his reflection in still water and saw not a prince, but a problem to be managed. When the political storm settled, David was king. The capital moved to Jerusalem, and time marched forward without the broken boy. He was sent east of the Jordan, far from the center of power, to a barren territory called Lo-debar. The name itself carries poetry of desolation. No pasture, no word. In Hebrew thought, Debar means both word and thing, so Lo-debar was literally nothingness. That is where the grandson of Israel's first king lived. No throne, no servants, no voice in the nation that once cheered his family's name. Each morning he woke to the ache in his legs and the heavier ache in his heart. Still, human hearts adapt. He found rhythm in routine. Some days he helped the shepherds with ledgers and food counts. Other days he simply sat and watched the horizon. In Lo-debar you could see forever, but nothing ever changed. Sometimes rumors drifted through travelers, songs of David's victories, the Ark of the Covenant returning to Jerusalem, a nation prospering under God's favor. Mephibosheth listened, torn between admiration and resentment. David had been his father's dearest friend, and by extension, his own possible protector. Yet he could not forget that David now sat on the throne that once belonged to his family. Shame became his shadow companion. In Hebrew culture, shame wasn't merely emotion. It was status, a social death. People avoided your eyes, not out of cruelty, but survival. Association with a cursed house could endanger one's own. So Mephibosheth hid, not only from enemies, but from memory itself. He spoke little of Saul, never of Jonathan. To survive, he buried his lineage beneath humility and self-deprecation. But memory is stubborn. On cold nights, when wind swept through the cracks of his dwelling, he would trace with his fingers the scars along his legs and whisper the names of those he'd lost. Somewhere deep within, the echo of covenant stirred, a story he had heard as a child, of two men who had promised HASN. He didn't know it yet, but that ancient promise was breathing its way toward him. The same God who anointed kings and humbled warriors had not forgotten the boy who fell. In the heavenly timeline, Mephibosheth's life was not over. It was paused, waiting for the intersection of grace and remembrance. And that is the paradox of faith. Even in exile, destiny can be ripening. Even in silence, covenant love is moving unseen. So when we next meet Mephibosheth, it will not be in the dust of Lodabar, but in the echo of a summons that would change everything. Because the king of Israel had just asked a question that no one expected him to ask. Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, to whom I may show HASN for Jonathan's sake? Mephibosheth had grown accustomed to the rhythm of smallness. In Lodabar there was no urgency, no expectation, no prophecy left to fulfill. The days slid into one another like sand through cracked fingers. Mephibosheth's legs ached most in the mornings, when the air was cold and the pain reminded him that life had spared him, but only halfway. He had learned to hide his bitterness beneath politeness, to answer kindly when people pitied him, and to look away when they whispered the name of Saul with the caution reserved for a ghost. Sometimes he would wheel himself toward the edge of the settlement where the scrubland began. From there he could see the faint shimmer of the Jordan Valley and the distant ridges beyond which Jerusalem lay. He wondered what the palace looked like now. He imagined marble instead of cedar, banners instead of dust. And then, inevitably, he would hear another voice in his mind, quiet, cynical, and cruel. That world isn't yours anymore. It was easier to believe the voice. Hope, when you have carried disappointment long enough, feels like cruelty dressed in light. Better to expect nothing, to shrink dreams down to the size of what you can control. A meal, a mat, a moment of rest before sleep. He spoke little of God. Once, as a child, he had memorized the Psalms of David that praised the faithfulness of Yahweh. Now he recited them only in fragments, the words half-remembered and hollow. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not. The sentence trailed off. He couldn't finish it. In Lodabar, the shepherd seemed far away, and the pasture, a cruel joke. At night he lay awake listening to the village sounds, the bleating of goats, the creak of carts, the soft conversations of other outcasts who had accepted exile as their permanent address. He wondered if anyone in Jerusalem ever spoke his name. Maybe a few of the old servants remembered. Perhaps a scribe had recorded the lineage of Saul and left his name in ink on a scroll gathering dust. But paper remembrance is not the same as human touch. The boy who once held a place in the royal family now had no one to call him son, grandson, or brother. The covenant of friendship between David and Jonathan felt like a myth told to comfort fools. Each morning he repeated the same ritual, water to the face, prayer whispered more from habit than faith, bread if there was any left. The men of the house of Mashir provided shelter out of charity, but charity has its limits. Guests are tolerated, not honored. He felt the difference in every gesture, the quick glances, the way conversations shifted when he entered. He was an obligation, not a companion. It's strange how a person can live in a house full of people and still die of loneliness. Mephibosheth's isolation wasn't just social, it was theological. In his mind, the God who had chosen David must have rejected him. The covenant God of Israel surely blessed those who walked upright. He, on the other hand, could barely stand. His body became the sermon he feared most, proof, or so he thought, that grace had limits. One afternoon, as dust spiraled in the courtyard and the sun burned mercilessly, a traveler passed through Lodabar. He carried news from Jerusalem. David had subdued his enemies, brought the ark to the city, written new psalms of thanksgiving. The man's voice was filled with admiration. "The king is a man after God's own heart," he said, "a righteous judge, merciful to his people." Merciful. The word stung. Mephibosheth smiled politely, but later, when he was alone, he whispered into the dry air, "Merciful to whom?" The syllables dissolved before they reached heaven. Days turned into seasons. Every new harvest reminded him that he had no inheritance to reap. Every festival reminded him that he had no family left to celebrate with. Sometimes he caught himself speaking to Jonathan as if his father were still alive. "You promised me, Abba," he murmured. "You said God was faithful." But the heavens remained silent, and the only answer was the wind moving through the reeds, soft, indifferent, ancient. Then came the dream. He saw himself standing, whole again, walking through the palace corridors of his youth. David sat on the throne, shining like the morning sun, and Mephibosheth approached to bow before him. But as he opened his mouth, no sound came. His tongue felt heavy, his throat dry. When he looked down, his legs were gone. He woke with a gasp, heart pounding, the taste of dust in his mouth. Some wounds, he realized, even dreams refused to heal. But what if the silence wasn't punishment at all? What if the stillness of Lo-debar was not the end of his story, but the setup for something so unthinkable that even angels held their breath? What if grace was already on the road, wearing the sandals of a king's messenger, heading straight for the house where shame had made its home? Still, in those final days before the knock came, Mephibosheth felt the lowest he had ever felt. His body weakened, his spirit flickered like a dying lamp. He stopped joining the evening meals and sat alone under the stars. He envied the constellations. They at least had a place, a pattern, a name spoken by God at creation. He, by contrast, felt nameless. Sometimes he rehearsed what he would say if ever summoned by David. "I am your servant," perhaps, or "Spare my life." But mostly he imagined judgment. Ancient kings secured their thrones by erasing rival bloodlines. Mercy was political suicide. If David remembered him at all, it would be to finish what time had delayed. Hope had become dangerous. He no longer dared to touch it. And yet, in the paradox only heaven could design, the darker his despair grew, the closer grace drew near. For while Mephibosheth mourned the ashes of his royal past, David sat in his palace asking questions no king had ever asked before. Is there anyone left of the house of Saul? In Lo-debar, a crippled man looked at his reflection in a basin of water and saw only failure. In Jerusalem, a king looked toward the horizon and saw a promise unfulfilled. Two worlds, one thread of covenant love pulling them toward collision. That is how grace works, quietly, steadily, against the noise of self-condemnation. Before Mephibosheth could move toward mercy, mercy had already begun moving toward him. He didn't know it yet, but the days of hiding were numbered. The footsteps he feared were already on their way, not to destroy him, but to deliver him from the land of no pasture into the banquet hall of a king. And for those who have felt forgotten, who have lived years believing their brokenness has erased their worth, this is where the story bends toward hope. Because when human plans collapse and self-esteem lies in ruins, the stage is finally clear for grace to walk in unopposed. Mornings always began like every other in Lo-debar. Thin light over cracked soil, the sound of distant goats, the ache that greeted him before consciousness fully arrived. Mephibosheth had long stopped expecting change. Hope was a luxury for other men. Yet even as he stared into the dust, events were unfolding in Jerusalem that would rewrite his story. King David sat in the cedar halls of his palace, sunlight spilling across stone. Victories were behind him, peace had settled over the land, and his heart turned toward remembrance. Out of nowhere, an old name surfaced like a forgotten melody. Jonathan, friend, brother, covenant keeper. And with that name came a question that startled even the courtiers nearby. Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I may show Hesed for Jonathan's sake? The word hung in the air. Hesed. Loyal, covenantal love. Not pity, not politics. A promise reaching across decades. An old servant named Ziba stepped forward, bowing low. There is still a son of Jonathan, he said cautiously, lame in both feet. David's reply was simple, almost breathless. Where is he? In that moment, heaven's timeline converged with earth's. Grace had just spoken Mephibosheth's name in the throne room of a king. Back in Lo-debar, the sound of horses shattered the quiet. Dust rose like a storm cloud as royal messengers rode through the settlement. When they stopped at his dwelling, neighbors froze. Soldiers in royal colors were not bearers of good news. "Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan," the captain announced. "The king commands your presence." His stomach turned cold. Every story he'd ever heard about fallen dynasties ended the same way, with a sword. He bowed his head, whispering to his servants, "It's all right. This was bound to happen." They lifted him onto a mule. The journey west felt endless, the barren ridges of Gilead giving way to the fertile valleys near Jerusalem. With every mile, memories stirred. His father's laughter, the sound of harps, the day of the fall. He rehearsed his plea for mercy, though he doubted words could change his fate. The city gates loomed ahead. Crowds parted. The palace rose above him, the same halls his grandfather once ruled. Now he entered as the crippled remnant of a lost house. When they carried him into the audience chamber, David was waiting. The shepherd king looked nothing like Saul. His eyes were gentler, his posture humble. Still, the weight of royalty filled the room. Mephibosheth collapsed before him, trembling. "Behold your servant," he whispered, face to the ground. David's voice cut through the silence. "Mephibosheth." He dared to look up. The king knew his name. "Do not be afraid," David said, "for I will surely show you Hesed for the sake of your father, Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat at my table continually." For a moment the words made no sense. Show me mercy? Restore my land? Eat at the king's table? Grace sounded absurd to ears trained by shame. Tears blurred his sight. He managed only one sentence. "What is your servant, that you should look upon a dead dog such as I?" That phrase, "dead dog," was the lowest form of self-abasement in ancient Hebrew speech. It revealed how thoroughly exile had rewritten his worth. Yet David did not flinch. He gestured to his attendants. "Bring Ziba, prepare the lands. This man will dwell among my sons." Heaven had broken through, not with thunder or fire, but through remembrance, a covenant kept, a promise fulfilled, a table opened to the undeserving. Outside, the sun dipped over Jerusalem's walls. Inside, a forgotten name had been spoken by grace, and the long drought of Lo-debar had finally ended. When Mephibosheth rose from the marble floor of the palace, the air itself felt different. Moments before, he had been the shame of Saul's house, a crippled exile hiding from justice. Now he stood as a guest of the king, clothed in royal favor he hadn't earned and couldn't explain. That is what Hesed looks like when it takes on flesh. In Hebrew thought, Hesed is more than mercy. It is love bound by covenant, loyalty that refuses to die, even when the other party has nothing left to offer. David was not acting out of guilt or obligation. He was remembering a promise rooted in divine character. When he said, "I will show kindness for Jonathan's sake," he was echoing the heartbeat of God himself, a God who remembers his people not because they are worthy, but because he made a covenant of grace. In that room, political logic shattered. By all the rules of the ancient Near East, Mephibosheth should have been executed. A new dynasty always erased the old. It was the way kingdoms protected stability. Yet David defied culture to obey covenant. He extended an open hand where vengeance was expected, and in doing so, he revealed a portrait of divine mercy centuries before Christ walked the earth. Theologians call this typology, moments in the Old Testament that foreshadow the greater redemption to come. David's table became a living prophecy of another table, one prepared for prodigals and outcasts. As David called Mephibosheth by name, so Christ would later call fishermen, tax collectors, and sinners, and every time the same word echoed through eternity. "Come, eat at my table continually." Mephibosheth's restoration was not partial. David gave him back everything that belonged to Saul: fields, servants, honor, and a place among the royal sons. But the greatest gift wasn't land, it was belonging. To sit at the king's table in ancient culture was more than an act of generosity, it was adoption language. To eat continually in the royal household meant, "You are under my protection. Your life is now bound to mine." That's grace, not a handout. but a homecoming. Imagine how Mephibosheth must have felt on that first evening. The long corridor to the dining hall gleamed with lamps. The aroma of roasted lamb drifted through the air. Servants pulled out a chair beside the king's sons. As he approached, the sound of his crutches echoed across the stone, a rhythm of brokenness entering the space of royalty. But when he sat down, the tablecloth of the king covered his feet. The very thing that once defined his shame was hidden beneath a symbol of fellowship. And that is what grace does. It doesn't pretend your scars never existed. It covers them with belonging. It hides your weakness under the weight of divine kindness. That's why this story still speaks so loudly. We live in a world obsessed with earning, with proving worth through performance, credentials, perfection. But the kingdom of God still runs on HASN. It's not about climbing your way back to the palace. It's about a king who leaves his throne to come find you in Lo-Debar. David's question, "Is there still anyone left?" mirrors God's own searching heart. He is still asking, even now. Is there anyone hiding in shame? Anyone thinking they're beyond my reach? Anyone who believes they are unworthy of grace? And when he finds them, he doesn't send soldiers to condemn. He sends grace to restore. For those who study Scripture deeply, the parallels are staggering. Mephibosheth represents humanity, crippled by a fall, living in exile, convinced we're disqualified. David represents the heart of God, seeking, remembering, redeeming. And the covenant between David and Jonathan reflects the eternal covenant sealed by the Son for the sake of the Father's promise. It's the gospel hidden in a royal chamber. This is the point where the story turns from history to revelation. God's grace is not a reaction to your goodness. It's the continuation of His promise. He made a covenant long before you failed. He keeps His word even when you can't walk straight. So when grace calls your name, don't argue. Don't list your disqualifications. Don't point to your broken legs. Simply come. Sit down. Let the tablecloth of mercy cover what shame once exposed. Because Mephibosheth's story isn't just about one man's redemption. It's the pattern of every believer's story. We are all children of a fallen house, all carried in our weakness, all summoned by a king who remembers a covenant made in blood. And when we finally take our seat, trembling yet chosen, heaven itself whispers the same words David once spoke. Do not be afraid. You shall eat at my table continually. Grace does not merely invite you to the table, it teaches you how to live there. For Mephibosheth, the summons from David was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his re-education in worth. Each morning he awoke in rooms lined with carved cedar, light streaming through windows he once thought he would never see again. Servants greeted him not as a burden, but as a noble. They spoke his name with honor. At first, he could hardly bear it. The habits of Lo-Debar clung to him like dust, apologizing too quickly, expecting rebuke, shrinking from attention. Shame has a long half-life. Even when the circumstance changes, the soul must learn that love is safe. The palace rhythm was different from exile. Bells marked prayer, laughter echoed from corridors, and every evening the great hall filled with the king's household. When Mephibosheth's place was set, it was not at the far end, but near David himself. At that table sat warriors like Abishai and Joab, princes born to privilege, musicians, counselors, and now a man who once hid among the forgotten. At first he could barely lift his eyes. His crutches leaned against the wall, a visible reminder of everything he could not do. But David never let the conversation dwell on pity. He asked about Mephibosheth's son, about the shepherds who worked his restored land. He laughed at small stories, listened to long pauses. The king was not performing charity. He was rebuilding a man. With time, something subtle began to shift inside Mephibosheth. The muscles of his heart, atrophied by fear, started to strengthen. He began to believe that perhaps the king's favor would not vanish with the next sunrise. He started sending provisions from his fields to the poor of Jerusalem, echoing the generosity shown to him. Grace had begun its true work, turning a receiver into a giver. Ancient Hebrew culture measured identity through lineage, and Mephibosheth's line had been considered cursed. Yet by eating daily with David, He received a new social status. To outsiders, he was no longer the lame grandson of Saul, but the one whom the king delights to honor. That is the quiet revolution of redemption. It rewrites the labels by which the world names you. There must have been evenings when, after the feasts ended, he lingered in the empty hall, tracing the grain of the table with his fingertips. Maybe he whispered a prayer of disbelief. "Why me, Lord? Why show such kindness to the son of your enemy?" And perhaps he heard, somewhere deep within, the answer that runs through Scripture. Because covenant love is stronger than failure. Grace did not erase his scars. It transformed what they meant. His crippled legs no longer testified to accident and loss. They became reminders of a journey only mercy could complete. Every step he took on those twisted feet proclaimed that weakness can sit in strength's presence without fear. The story records that Mephibosheth remained in Jerusalem and ate continually at the king's table. Those words, ate continually, suggest rhythm, permanence, home. He didn't visit grace, he lived in it. Think of the contrast. Lo-debar, silence, scarcity, isolation. Jerusalem, music, provision, fellowship. One was a geography of despair, the other a geography of restoration. Yet the real transformation wasn't the change of address, it was the change of identity. Inside, the orphan spirit gave way to sonship. He no longer measured his worth by his usefulness, but by his relationship to the king. That is the miracle of divine adoption. We sit at the table not because we can contribute, but because we are loved. Sometimes visitors would notice him and whisper. Some still remembered the old rivalry, still judged by the logic of power and bloodlines. But David's consistent affection silenced them. The king's acceptance became Mephibosheth's defense. When grace takes up residence in your life, it doesn't remove all criticism. It simply makes it irrelevant. And over time, Mephibosheth learned to walk, not on perfect legs, but in perfect acceptance. He walked in the dignity of a restored name, a reclaimed inheritance, a redeemed story. He could look back toward Lo-debar without bitterness and forward toward eternity without fear. This is what heaven intends for every soul rescued from exile, not a momentary pardon, but a permanent place. To live daily in the atmosphere of favor until love feels like home. Because true transformation is not about what changes around you, but what awakens within you when the king calls you his own. And if Mephibosheth's story teaches us anything, it's this. Grace doesn't just change history, it changes hearts. And now, it's your turn to stand where he stood. Maybe you've lived so long in your own version of Lo-debar that you stopped believing the king still remembers your name. Your no-pasture place might look like an unhealed loss, an addiction you can't shake, a dream that's gathered too much dust. You've convinced yourself that this is just how life will be now. Quieter, smaller, safe from disappointment. You've learned to manage the ache, to stay out of the way, to live at arm's length from hope. But even there, grace comes riding toward you. It comes not because you've earned it, but because there's a covenant written over your life, a promise sealed in blood far older and stronger than your failures. Like Mephibosheth, you might think the king's summons means judgment. Maybe you've been hiding from prayer because you assume God is waiting with a list of accusations. Maybe the thought of facing him makes you feel exposed. But what if the voice calling your name isn't angry? What if it's tender? What if the king who sits on the throne remembers not your sin, but his promise? That's what Jesus came to prove, that divine love doesn't begin with your effort, it begins with his covenant. When he stretched his arms on the cross, he did what David did, but greater. He made room at the table for sons and daughters who had forgotten they belonged. Think of it, the son of David extending the same hesed to you that David once extended to Mephibosheth. Grace didn't just find him, it adopted him. Grace doesn't just find you, it transforms you. You may say, but I'm broken, my legs are weak, my faith wavers. So was his. Grace doesn't require perfect strength, it invites honest surrender. When Mephibosheth sat at that table, his weakness didn't vanish, it was simply covered by the king's cloth. The same is true of you. God doesn't erase your humanity. He restores your dignity. You might not have royal robes, but you have his righteousness. You might not walk perfectly, but you are carried by covenant. And that means your failures no longer define your name. His favor does. Every one of us carries the echo of a fall. Some of us fell through our own choices, others through someone else's mistake. Either way, the ground hurts the same. And like that nurse who stumbled with the child in her arms, life can drop us hard. But the beauty of the gospel is that God picks up what the fall broke. He doesn't send messengers to destroy you. He sends grace to deliver you. He doesn't shame you for hiding. He comes to where you are and says, "You don't belong here anymore." That's what makes Christianity unlike any other story in human history. Every other system says, "Climb your way back to God." This one says, "God climbed down to find you." So I have to ask, where is your Lodabar? Is it a secret habit that's hardened into a prison? Is it a wound you never speak of because you fear it would make people see you differently? Is it the heaviness that sits on your chest when you wake up and wonder if your life still matters? Wherever that place is, grace knows the root. And the same king who remembered the house of Saul is remembering you. Maybe your story hasn't turned yet. Maybe you're still on the journey, being carried toward the palace, terrified of what comes next. But listen, mercy always outruns fear. When you finally see the king's face, you'll understand that his purpose was never to punish you, but to restore you. And when you finally sit at his table, when you finally realize you're welcome, something inside you will shift. You'll stop introducing yourself by your failures. You'll stop defining your life by what you lost. You'll begin to say, "I am who the King says I am." That's the new identity grace gives. Beloved, not broken. Chosen, not condemned. Seated, not striving. You see, grace isn't sentimental, it's structural. It rebuilds the very framework of your self-understanding. It moves you from being a fugitive of shame to a child of covenant. So, if you've been wondering whether you still have a seat at God's table, the answer has never changed. The seat has been set since Calvary. The invitation has your name on it. And even if your legs can't carry you, grace will. There's a verse in 2 Samuel that sums it all up. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both his feet. Notice how the story ends exactly where it began, with his brokenness. The Bible doesn't edit it out. God leaves the limp in the story, so we'll remember that grace doesn't require perfection to be powerful. Your limp doesn't disqualify you. It identifies you as one who's been carried. And perhaps that's why your story still has power. Because when people see your scars, they'll see his mercy. So today, wherever you are, let the King's words echo again. Do not be afraid. You shall eat at my table continually. You are not forgotten. You are not disqualified. You are remembered by covenant, redeemed by grace, and restored by love. And when grace finally carries you home, you'll realize that all along, the King had been walking toward you through every wilderness you thought would last forever. There's a sacred hush that follows grace, the kind that falls after storms and miracles alike. It's not the noise of victory or the applause of spectators. It's quieter, deeper. It's the sound of belonging finally sinking in. I imagine Mephibosheth in his later years, hair gray, hands trembling slightly as he lifts bread from the table of the king. Around him, conversations hum and laughter rises, but his eyes are fixed on David, the man who remembered him when the world forgot. Maybe sometimes he still woke in the night, startled by dreams of falling, by echoes of running feet and breaking bone. Maybe there were days when shame tried to whisper again, "You don't deserve this." But then he would glance down the length of the table, see the king's steady smile, and remember that love stronger than fear had written his new name. That is the rhythm of grace, remembrance conquering regret. And if you listen carefully, you'll realize that Mephibosheth's story is still unfolding, not in ancient palaces, but in living hearts. Because every time someone who feels forgotten dares to believe that God still has a seat for them, Lo-Debar loses another captive. Every time a broken soul whispers yes to mercy, Another table is set in heaven's memory. The world tells us to hide our limp, to pretend our scars are gone. But the gospel tells us to bring them, because only the carried know the strength of the arms that lift them. Your weakness is not a disqualification, it's a doorway. It's proof that you were never meant to walk to the palace alone. Maybe that's why Jesus kept showing scars after the resurrection. He didn't hide his wounds. He transformed them into testimony. That's what God longs to do with yours. He takes the things that broke you and turns them into evidence of his nearness. Think again of the table. Under its covering, Mephibosheth's twisted legs disappeared. What once exposed him to ridicule was now hidden under fellowship. Every meal became a reminder that mercy covers what shame reveals, and that same grace covers you. Every flaw, every regret, every fear that you are somehow less than the people who seem to have it together. God does not measure you by the strength of your stride, but by the sincerity of your surrender. You may still limp. You may still wonder. But if you're seated at the King's table, you're already home. That is the spiritual echo of this story. That love remembers, that covenant keeps, that grace restores. And when the King of Kings calls your name, you can stop hiding. You can stop earning. You can finally exhale. You belong here, not because you walked into the palace under your own power, but because mercy carried you in. And maybe that's the truest miracle of all, that heaven would look at your life, at your limp, and still call you beloved. So tonight, when the world grows quiet and your thoughts start to wander back to the what-ifs and the not-enoughs, remember this: you are not living in Lodabar anymore. Grace found you, grace lifted you, grace seated you, and somewhere in eternity, the King still smiles and says your name with delight. My friends, if this story stirred something inside you, if it reminded you that you still have a place at the table, don't let that moment slip away. Take a deep breath, whisper a prayer, and let gratitude rise. Say, "Thank you, Lord, for remembering me." And if this message spoke to your heart, share it. Share it so someone else wandering through their own Lodabar might hear the footsteps of grace coming for them too. Because stories like this aren't meant to stay in the palace. They're meant to travel across deserts. They're meant to find the forgotten and whisper, "The King still calls your name."